te whānau, welcome to Newsroom's weekly political podcast. For those of you joining us on Raw Politics for the first time, welcome, and for those of you who know us well and are returning listeners, welcome back. Now, I am joined by our Newsroom Politics A-team this week. As usual, I've got Marc Daalder, our senior political reporter, joining me in Wellington. Up in Auckland, we have Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy, and I am political editor Laura Walters. Now, before we get into the thick of it, you two, I wanted to ask for everyone's favourite tweet, meme, quote from this week's presidential debate. My favourite is, I guess, depictions or imaginations of what these Trump so-called transgender aliens look like. And I particularly liked the picture of E.T. Dressed up in women's clothing. It was a real nostalgia hit for me. Do you have one for us, Tim?
I do, and it was a lovely photograph of a sweet little cat lying asleep on a pillow with a big revolver sitting next to it for its protection.
How about yours, Marc?
Mine was a video and or audio piece, which we'll put in here, of Donald Trump's rant about cats and dogs and the people eating them, which turns out lines up very nicely with the theme song from Peanuts, the TV show. So
they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
Worth a listen.
Yeah, and I think a bit of a congratulations to us three on picking just one, because there were so many, there's so much material on the internet coming out of that debate, and we will talk about the debate a little bit more later on. So the three topics we have on Raw Politics this week are David Seymour versus Christopher Luxon on the Treaty Principles Bill, and kind of David Seymour versus everyone else, it seems, at the moment. We'll have the definitive analysis on the US presidential debate and public service gagging orders. And as always, to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. It seems like we just cannot escape the Treaty Principles Bill, and neither can Christopher Luxon. We have had another week, a first week with politicians back at Parliament after a recess. Again, this flagship policy of ACT leader David Seymour sucking up all of the oxygen, and we saw the Prime Minister getting a little bit pissed off this week, I think. The issue kind of drew out throughout the week. It started at Monday afternoon's post-Cabinet press conference. Questions continued on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, we saw what Cabinet actually agreed to, along with some Cabinet papers and assessment and advice from officials as well. So we're going to dig into this a little bit. We have spoken about the Treaty Principles Bill and the division and the issues around Māori Crown relations quite a lot on the podcast recently. It's just something that we haven't been able to escape, but we can't avoid it this week. It really came to a bit of a head on Monday. RNZ, started off the week with a really great exclusive story that finally David Seymour was taking something that looked like a proposal to Cabinet on the Treaty Principles Bill, and then rather than front-footing it, post-Cabinet press conference, Christopher Luxon just had to react to a whole lot of questions. And he has, over recent weeks and months made no secret of the fact that he doesn't like the Treaty Principles Bill, but the fact that on Monday he offered how much he disliked it, and he didn't really care to hide his frustration with the whole situation, I thought was particularly telling. He also, freely offered, without much pushing by journalists at all, that, it was I think he said it was a big part of why it took a long while for us to get there in terms of coalition negotiations. So he specifically talked about that being a sticking point, something that everyone assumed, but, he's very firmly put that on the record. He also, again, went out of his way to say that they made a compromise, that National was not happy, that ACT was not happy, not just this is how coalitions work and compromises, but none of us are happy. And I think Luxon really showed how unhappy he was on Monday. And I think we all got a bit of a whiff of that division or that, tension between Seymour and Luxon. And of course, then journalists got a bit of a sniff of blood there and kept probing further. Now, with all of that in mind, I wondered whether, Marc, you might be able to step us back a little bit and talk about what we've now actually seen this week in terms of solid commitments from the government and from Cabinet on the treaty principles and what's changed there.
Yeah, the principles don't have a single available definition. Up till now, there's been definitions by the courts primarily, by other thinkers and legal writers and so on. This is an attempt by the government to put a specific definition forward, and it seems that the most controversial bit is the interpretation of Article 2 of the treaty in particular, where the proposed language in the cabinet paper is something along the lines of iwi and hapu have rights that they assume they would have by signing up to the treaty, but that those rights are only different from the rights of every other New Zealander where it's explicitly stated in legislation or treaty settlements or some other agreement with the Crown. So you look at that initially and you go, oh, this sounds reasonable. But then you get to that extra caveat and you go, okay, hang on. Basically what this is saying is unless it's explicitly written somewhere, that those treaty rights don't
count
exist.
for anything. Yeah.
And the Ministry of Justice officials in the regulatory impact statement pushed back really strongly on that bit in particular. They said, we don't think this is actually consistent with the treaty. We think that the treaty, and it's long been accepted that the treaty establishes collective rights for Māori as the indigenous people of New Zealand, right? That it's not just we're all here together and it doesn't matter. It actually does matter because there were some people who were here first, and that's what that article is supposed to do, and this erases that.
Mm-mm. So we've kind of got not just Christopher Luxon unhappy with this policy. We know that obviously opposition parties are not happy. We know that New Zealand First, the same thing, agreed to vote it through the first reading to the Select Committee. Nothing more than that. But now we're also seeing that officials are unhappy with it as well. We could assume that there was some leaked documents out of the Ministry of Justice earlier this year, but now we've seen very specifically that the expert advice is this isn't right, that we would prefer the status quo. Given all of this, Tim, what do you think that it means for the coalition, this kind of potential tension, division, difference of position between the parties that we're seeing play out?
First, I think I should apologise. I'm not even sure if I did this, but I probably blamed Winston Peters and New Zealand First for dragging out the coalition negotiations. Seems now we could put more of that blame over to this thorny little number that ACT had been pushing and delaying us forming a government back in November. It is something that it was obvious at that press conference on Monday is just an irritant now, but it's a necessary irritant. They have to go through it. It's kind of like some medical procedure. You have to do it, and you're just going to sort of grit your teeth and get it done. It'll go on, though, I think, and you can correct me, I think you guys with the detail, but seems like the Select Committee will be hearing and maybe responding right through to the early part of the first quarter of next year.
They've agreed for a 6-month
which will take us
process
to the period when David Seymour assumes the Deputy Prime Ministership and becomes more obviously, representative of this joint coalition government. So, look, it's going to go on. It's going to be a constant. I'm not sure the fight is worth it for ACT in the end, but they've obviously decided that's where they want to go. It was interesting to me that the other aspect, Laura, where Luxon showed some irritation on Monday with Seymour was over that groceries regulation and that very snippy comment about the last time I looked, the Minister of Commerce was Andrew Bailey, sort of spoke volumes as well. But that's actually an area where ACT, the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, originally, ought to be standing up. And he's the Minister of Regulation. He's an Associate Minister of Finance. He's got some ability to go into those zones because he picked carefully what portfolios he'd have his oar in. And so that there is more where you'd expect ACT to be making hay and to be making gain. They've got a bit of a bone between their teeth, if you like, on this treaty principles. We've seen people do it in the past. Don Brash got taken very strongly with things race and constitution. It didn't really go well then, and I'm not sure that this is going to go that well for them, where there's fertile territory in other areas.
I'm interested in your point there, Tim, that this 6-month select committee process, we expect to see, well, they've committed to the first reading at some point in November on this bill, then we'll have the 6-month select committee, and then, as you say, David Seymour will assume the deputy prime ministership. I'm interested in what you think, Marc, on how Seymour changes at that time. At the moment, we've got him at war, on the treaty principles. We've got him really pushing back or kind of stepping in over the top of Andrew Bailey on terms of regulation, like you say, Tim. We've got him going to war with his officials at the Ministry of Justice, Te Arawhiti. We assume PCO, who draft the legislation based on a redacted section of a cabinet paper. He's kind of acting as ACT party leader at the moment. Does that change when he becomes the Deputy Prime Minister? Does he have to become more of a statesman, or because he's in that second half of the term, is he still going to be, in campaign mode?
I think, like Donald Trump, I don't think we're going to see David Seymour take on any sort of different level of statesmanship depending on the role he holds, which, you might have thought by being a member of the three, party leaders forming this government and a senior minister in cabinet, he might have changed from pre-election David Seymour. I think it would be very fair to say that hasn't happened, given, to some extent using the tools of being a minister to continue and prosecute those battles, like his cabinet paper on the treaty principles bill, where he specifically lays out departmental and official advice saying this is a bad idea. And basically he says in one I'm disappointed in the ministry's comment about this because they're obviously wrong. That latter bit of paraphrase, but the disappointed is an interesting thing to say about your own officials, right? I don't expect that being deputy PM would rein him in anymore. It obviously hasn't reined in Winston Peters, and I don't think David Seymour is going to, let it affect him.
And just lastly, Tim, you said that we've probably all blamed, at least in our minds, New Zealand First for holding up those coalition negotiations. Also, we've spoken a lot about, who would be the person that could potentially fracture this coalition or break it if, it were to get to that point. We've attributed that to Winston Peters a lot as well. By we, I mean, the broader commentariat. But do you think that that's still the case, given what we're seeing? It's already a bit of an awkward three-way. Is Seymour going to be the one that could cause that fracture?
Well, he's becoming Winston Peters. He's becoming the kind of the flibbity-gibbet, the will-o-the-wisp. How do you solve a problem like David Seymour? We might have said that about Winston Peters in the past. But he's become that guy that, how are you going to hold this moonbeam in your hand? How are you going to catch that wave on the sand? All those lines that over the years have kind of been in the mind of someone like Peters, who's just impossibly difficult to corral or to, put expectations on. Now, this must be a strategy by Seymour and by ACT. They must have decided that this is the way to keep their percentage up, that the way they did it between 2017 and 2020 and between 2020 and 23 to keep themselves at 8% and 11 MPs is the way that they're going to achieve this at 2026. So they're not going to sort of sit back. As Marc said, we're not going to see a statesman. We're going to see a political leader keep going, because they must believe that prodding, being the kind of the awkward hedgehog in the coalition that no one's, when it curls up, no one can sort of get at or touch or even get any sense into, is where they're going to be. So look, no, I think most likely this coalition lasts, is my thinking now, through to 26, and the person who'll cause it most ongoing irritation and grief will be Seymour rather than Peters. So there's a change.
Did you have in mind a particular medical procedure, Tim, or do you think the Treaty Principles Bill is, say, the colonoscopy of this government?
I wouldn't go that far, Marc, but I do think it's a very, very strong and unappealing dose of something.
Thank you. And I'll just wrap it up with something a little bit more family friendly. Thank you for the Sound of Music reference, Tim. Always appreciate one of those. Now, Tim, I'm not sure how you viewed this week's presidential debate, but Marc and I were in the Newsroom office working incredibly hard, eating popcorn with the showdown up on the big screen. Of course, we were all tuned in, whether it was watching the live feeds on Twitter or watching the debate in real time or delayed. It was impossible to ignore. We had, of course, the second presidential debate ahead of this year's US election, but the first face-off between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We are going to try and take a look at the debate. We're not going to delve into the US politics and policies so much, but take a little bit of a look at this debate, the style, the tricks, and whether these types of debates actually matter. But before we kick off, I just wanted to read you all, if you'll indulge me, a quote. And thank you to Tim for tweeting this and bringing it to my attention, because I thought it was just the most fantastic beginning to an opinion piece from New York Times opinion writer Frank Bruni. It said, in Kamala Harris's big general election debate 4 years ago, she faced off against an opponent with a fly on his head, and I think we'll all remember that. It goes on to say, in her immeasurably bigger debate on Tuesday night, she confronted an opponent with bats inside his head, and out they came, flapping and screeching when he brought up cats and dogs. What a start to a piece, and it absolutely perfectly summed it up. Now, before we get into the substance of this, I wondered if we could do a quick fire, get it all on the record. Tim, we'll start with you. Who won?
Oh, no doubt it was Harris. And you couldn't, no person, unless they're completely partisan, could say otherwise in terms of debating, other than to question the fact that he was fact-checked a few times. But, given the ones we've seen globally all around the world over many years in the UK here, other ones that we see, Australia, New Zealand, no doubt she was all over him like a rash.
Yeah, absolutely. And Marc, how about you? Who was the winner?
I also think Kamala Harris won. I think the SPCA lost. Yeah, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Kamala Harris definitely won that one. She just ran rings around him from start to finish. But Marc, I'm really interested in getting your perspective as an American. How patriotic did you feel watching that display yesterday? Look, I think I would say I rarely feel patriotic. It was nice to see people who fully open their mouths when they speak, which is, of course, a New Zealand trait that, you haven't quite landed. But other than that, I mean, I saw a tweet the other day that I then realized applied to me, where someone said, I'm in my late 20s and every presidential election I voted in has been an election where Donald Trump was running. And then I realized that, that's me as well. And it's not a good feeling, is it, to go, this is our model for democracy. Maybe needs some repairs at some stage.
And it's hard, isn't it? Because we've, it's so far, we've been discussing this in this podcast episode, it's been quite light, and it's easy to do that, to make light of it, to laugh. Some of it's so ridiculous. But this is, a global superpower that we're talking about. And these are the types of things that we're hearing from a former president, potentially a future president as well. So it's kind of a laugh or cry situation sometimes. I'm also interested, we all agree that Kamala Harris won this debate. I'm interested, Marc, why you think she won the debate.
Yeah, I think she won because she was in the same world as the moderators and hopefully most of the audience. And Donald Trump was just not, right? It's not about landing a particular blow. It's not about her policy was better than his. It's simply that what she said was relevant to America, and what Donald Trump said was relevant to people who watch Fox News, which, to be fair, is a decent chunk of America.
Or some pretty extreme and fringe YouTube channels as well.
Or listen to J.D. Vance.
Yeah. I also, I take your point on that, being in the same world, speaking sense, speaking to issues that matter to people. But, she still came very, very prepared, didn't she? I think, putting her opponent aside for a second, it was a good performance by a presidential candidate. And and I think we discussed this while watching it, like on the issue of abortion, she had those real life experiences from women who hadn't been able to seek or get medical treatment that they needed because of law changes and overturning of Roe v. Wade. And she just did that so well. She had the right mix of policy and that bringing it to life with those very emotive personal experiences. So I thought that was very well done by her as well. I mean, what do you think, Tim? I'm sure that you've watched many a political debate in your time. How does it stack up against others that you've seen?
I groaned at her first response. She was asked how are people better off 4 years on from the Biden-Harris administration. Her response was just segueing off into totally unrelated matters. When I would have thought, and I think Biden and she would, if they were sort of not in that focal point of a debate, would say that there are various measures they can say people are better off than 4 years ago when the COVID crisis had just hit and so on and so on. But I thought that was terrible. I was groaning, thinking, oh, Lord, here we go. But I did think, Laura, your point that she was extremely well briefed, and that's come out recently from some staffers of hers who spoke, didn't they, in the media about how demanding and exacting she is, and she expects them to be fully prepared, and she tests them on all these things. That was showed repeatedly through this. One point I took that I thought, well, that is absolutely briefed, is the time when she was talking about Ukraine, Putin not stopping at Ukraine, going on to Poland, and the 800,000 Polish ethnicity Americans living in Pennsylvania, Donald, might have a view on you letting Poland become vulnerable. That kind of fact, appropriately delivered, right time, right sequence, is well trained and well delivered. In terms of debates, look, this was a walkover, but it wasn't a demolition or embarrassment like Biden's performance against Trump, and Trump didn't really even do much of that. And Biden kind of fell rather than was pushed largely. But in the past, George W. Bush lost a debate, didn't perform very well. By common sort of judgment, he was a loser, but went on to win the election. Similarly, I think in might have been 2016 against Hillary, Trump was found by consensus to have lost a debate, but again, it didn't matter. These things are so close, and the people who watch them might look for different things, as Marc says. Some people might have liked all that grimacing and scowling and leaning forward and gripping the table and forcefully, accusing people of all kinds of operations in prison on, transgender aliens and things. This sort of stuff actually might sail for some, but probably not for the middle where they're both fighting. So look, I thought it was a clear and really interesting and gripping example of these things, Laura, but you can't just go from that and say, well, here we are, we're on our way from her camp or from him. And he's already claiming 92%, of people are saying it's a victory. So maybe we're wrong.
What? Donald Trump misrepresenting results? No way.
Impossible.
Wouldn't hear of it.
Yeah. There was an interesting analysis in the New York Times after the debate by, I think, Nate Cohn, looking at previous debates and what happens when someone wins. And kind of the conclusion was, when you've got someone who is less well known to the public and they win a debate, that they tend to get a boost in the polling that lasts through to the election day. So his examples there were John Kerry in 2004, Barack Obama in 2008, and then Mitt Romney in 2012. They all got polling bumps after, good debate performances, and they kept that edge through to the election day. Even if it wasn't enough to win them the election, as in the case of Kerry and Romney, it was still, they were higher than they were before the debate. But when a candidate is already relatively well known, in those cases it was Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Biden against Trump. Trump's never won a debate because, again, it's that problem of the people who judge whether you win the debate or not are in a different world from him. they get a brief bump, but then it comes back down. And by the time people went to the ballot booth on election day in 2016 and 2020, the debate was not the thing that they were thinking of.
That brings us to our audience question. And our question for this week is, which ministries are forcing staff to sign NDAs or non-disclosure agreements? Mark, can you give us the rundown on this?
Yeah, there have been a couple of news stories this week finding that 2 ministries in particular have made a significant number of staff sign non-disclosure agreements in the past year or so. That's Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, which has had 67 staffers sign NDAs around the work that they're doing on fixing the financial situation there, which might include cutting of jobs and things. And then at the Ministry for the Environment, 38 people have been made to sign NDAs, and that's in relation to the fast track bill and the list of projects that have been submitted there.
So it's really interesting, those 2 specific ministries. I mean, Tim, Mark mentioned a little bit of the work that they're trying to protect there and to, stop people from talking about. What do you think this says about the fear of leaks at those particular organisations or more broadly within the public service under this government?
Well, it's a fear of leaks, but it's also a commitment to secrecy, that this also puts some of this material and deliberations beyond the scope of the Official Information Act, or so they're arguing, or will argue legally. So you get this scene where already public servants, under all their contracts, will have an obligation of confidentiality, and as many people in the private sector do. Sometimes in the private sector and the public sector, if there are major commercial financial implications to markets in particular, there will be NDAs for projects, but not for ongoing sort of general policy plans and work programs. So I think it's another step. It's another sort of retraction or retreat from any chance of explanation, openness, or contestability of what's being said. And it's just another indication of why there needs to be probing, and there needs to be media seeking information from within public servants who, in an honourable way, believe that some of this stuff needs to be known. The very fact of the NDAs has probably been leaked, actually.
I have a slightly different reading of it, Tim. I think it would be interesting to see what happens, and I'm sure these will get challenged with the Ombudsman. But generally, he said you can't contract out of the OIA. At the same time, often when there have been contracts like this, he's sided on saying, actually, it's not in the public interest for it to be released. The degree to which the existence of an NDA maybe influences his view on that, you can argue about that. But to me, it feels much more like this is about telling particular staffers, the ones who are signing these NDAs, if you leak, this is an extra method we can use to punish you. Not just you get fired, but like who knows what else is in there in terms of penalties and so on. So that it is fear of leaks, and therefore fighting that through making people afraid to leak.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations. The best thing you've watched, read, or listened to this week that you have really enjoyed and would like to share with our audience. Tim, let's start with you.
I liked a story by Eloise Gibson on RNZ at a conference, a report from a conference in which the Climate Minister, Simon Watts, had explained why the return to coal mining is a positive, because, as he explained, there's coal and then there's coal.
That's a great shout out to a former newsroomer.
Yes, and a hated rival from my perspective as a climate journalist. My recommendation for this week, we're not allowed to plug our own work apparently, so I've picked work by the second best writer with a surname Daalder, which is in The Atlantic on the US election, called How to Save America. It's by my dad, so read plenty of his things, not worth reading. This one I really enjoyed, so would recommend that people have a look.
That is very cute, Mark. And mine for this week is Andrea Vance's latest piece in The Post on the $410,000 spent on contractors and consultants at the Ministry for Regulation. It's her latest in a series scrutinising this new ministry. It's well worth a read. That is it from the Raw Politics team for this week. Thank you so much to our producer, Trent Doyle, and to all of our readers, listeners, and viewers. If you have any burning thoughts that you would like to share with us, send them my way. My email address is laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.